The last time I was here was in 1999, and that was for the Women in Ireland Network Conference. I don't know if any of you were here then, I'm showing my age. But that was a really, really interesting conference, and I made many friendships at that conference, which I still have to this day. My colleague Katrina Nilera, who I work with, I met at that conference. I had just met Breda Gray before that because we worked together. I think, Mary, that was the first time we ever met, actually. Louise Ryan, a range of others. And just to say how important St Mary's is, really, in that regard, and how important the Centre for Irish Studies is, because these events and the association, the British Association of Irish Studies, they do keep us networked, and friendships over nearly 20 years are forged, and they're as important, I think, in our intellectual work as the ideas we're phrasing. So long may it continue. I'm going to speak today about family, and so, okay, let's get going. Interestingly, when I was in the loo, I met the bride. And I thought, wow, this really fits with my talk on today, just before she went into the church. And having just done a summer school, as Mary said, on love and marriage, I think it's destined to follow me everywhere, even to the loo. Anyway, that's another story. So in this final session, I suppose what has been a really wonderful conference, I have to say, my main task is to explore the central role of the so-called Irish family, and I do use that term in quotes as I go along. And I want to look at the central role of the Irish family in the context of transformation, which I would also like to put in inverted commas, because I think it's quite important that we don't over-romanticise transformation. And I suppose I'm a sociologist, so part of my job in society is to drill down and to question some of these terms and how we might use them. So I'm going to do that today in relation to family. I've been long interested in how the politics of the personal intertwine with and can shape prevailing understandings of Irish studies and Irish identities. By nature, I am suspicious of meta-narratives that fail to take into account human experience. And I very much agreed with Patrick earlier of how theatre, for instance, is a very interesting way of understanding human experience, of linking human experience in society with transformation. Family is, of course, an absolutely huge theme, and it's a universal theme in all Irish studies, and indeed in our lives more generally. I think family tends to be invariably considered in two contrasting ways. First of all, it's often romanticised and presented as a kind of a haven in a heartless world. It's where we go for protection, sustenance, and love in an otherwise complex world. So we have that sort of view of family as a haven in a heartless world. Or on the other hand, it's often viewed as the source of all our problems and ills in society, our own problems, and also society more broadly understood. So there's two, I think, very different perspectives which recur time and time again, both in theoretical positions on the role of family in society, but also in how, for instance, creative writers can conceptualise families as either very idyllic and rosy, or as oppressive, stroke, even abusive. So we have these kind of contrasting views of family that reproduce themselves in the theoretical positions and in the way in which family is created and recreated in the social imaginary. Family and what it means is, of course, a source of endless fascination and interrogation. So therefore, I'm not sure if I have any definite answers. This is more, I think, an exploration of the concept of family than the final word, or something that is so distinctive. So before I go on, I suppose, to provide what I might call my substantive analysis of the so-called Irish family, I just want to start briefly with some remarks about the theme of rhetoric in my title. And I found this very interesting in listening to Mary McAleese last night. And the family, because she mentioned the global family a few times. So family is, of course, a subject of huge rhetorical import in Ireland. Perhaps one of the most powerful 20th century examples of this is De Valera's 1943 St. Patrick's Day speech. So So just very quickly, he refers to a land whose countryside would be bright with cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, the laughter of comely maidens, whose firesides would be the forums of the wisdom of serene old age. If anything, we might call this the high romantic period of the family. The 1937 Constitution is also a document that is infused with what we might call familial rhetoric. Under Article 41.1, the state promises to protect the family and recognises the family as having inalienable and imprescriptible rights, antecedent and superior to all positive law. No loftier a claim could be made about any social group's role in society. Women were also accorded a very specific familial role, something I've written about elsewhere, and this clause remains in the Constitution. Woman, by her life within the home, gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. Woman by her life, as opposed to women by their work, which is a kind of a different terminology. The state shall therefore endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. So here we see notions of the common good being tied up with a particular interpretation of women's position in society as being primarily and exclusively within the family. So the bit I want to tease out today is the rhetoric of 1937, which is still in the Constitution, how that really fits with the actual social reality in the trends that we see emerging in family. Again, we see the Irish diaspora is in a way referred to as a family with common ancestry part of the terminology there. The Irish nation cherishes its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry, not citizenship, interestingly, Mary, living abroad, who share its cultural identity and heritage. Again, ancestry, I'm not going to go into this, but ancestry as a term has been widely deconstructed, particularly in ethnic and racial studies. So anyway, it's in the Irish Constitution. So I suppose, so really moving fast forward, I just want to pick on just a couple more examples of rhetoric. And the next person I want to focus on is the current Irish Taoiseach, Linda Connolly. And he's no better really than De Valera, because he's also widely known to invoke the symbol of family in key interventions. And I think in two ways, and I'm going to give a couple of examples. One is in terms of the diaspora as a unified global family, again, more in keeping with this construction of family as the kind of haven in the heartless world, a source of solidarity, versus, I suppose, what we've seen, again, what Patrick was referring to earlier, the kind of the dark past as a source of shame and destruction, the kinds of abuses that you were talking about. So again, just a couple of examples. I'm not going to read it all out. So this is a speech by Linda Connolly at the launch of the Global Diaspora Strategies Toolkit on the 27th of September. And just cutting through, he says, "Our global family may be diverse and dispersed, but it remains firmly committed to an interest in this country's long-term prosperity." Okay. He then more recently goes on, and this was at, which I'm guessing some of you were at, the launch of the Global Ireland's Diaspora Policy on the 3rd of March 2015. He said, "We must endeavour to ensure mutual benefits for Ireland and our committed family, okay? And as our Irish family stretches out across the world, it is important that welfare remains very much at the heart of our work." So I think it's very interesting, I suppose, to look at what might be termed familial discourses and how they infuse Irish public life and are used to galvanise collective representations of Irish identity. And we see this recurring again and again. I've just given you a couple of examples. But at the same time, I suppose more recently, we also see shame, or what might be termed the dark side of the family, coming to the fore. And to return to Taoiseach, these second two sets of quotes I suppose, referred to those who were outcast by the so-called protective layer that families were and are supposed to provide for us. So again, the first, they're both basically apologies. The first is a speech in reaction to the publication of the Cloyne report, which really was about, I suppose, systemic clerical sex abuse in the Diocese of Cloyne. And again, he refers here to, I'll just read it out quickly. Cloyne's revelations are heartbreaking. It describes how many victims continue to live in the small towns and parishes in which they were reared and which they were abused. Their abuser often still in the area and still held in high regard by their families and the community. The abusers continue to officiate at family weddings and funerals. In one case, the abuser even officiated at the victim's own wedding. Again, the second is the apology, where again Enda Kenny apologises to the victims of the Magdalen laundries, and he says the McAleese report, that is the Martin McAleese report, shines a bright and necessary light on a dark chapter of Ireland's history. So there are, of course, several examples of how what I would call a complex interconnection between constructions of solidarity and also shame come to the fore at critical junctures in recent Irish history. And the family is more often than not at the centre of these interventions in some way or other, as either a source of solidarity or a source of shame and something to be apologised for. So a key, I suppose, what we have in these quotes today are, on the one hand, a call to solidify a positive global Irish identity vis-à-vis the diaspora as a global family, and another, a call to face up to the oppression, the incarceration, the shame and abuse of a darker past. So a key question I want to explore, therefore, is, specifically in the context of family life, love, marriage, is, after decades of documented oppression and the dark past referred to and now acknowledged by the government themselves, is Ireland really now a haven of liberalism and acceptance in the context of family, love and marriage? And of course, here I'm referring to the same-sex referendum, which Mary McAleese talked about last night. Is the dark past truly in the dark past? Or are we in truth witnessing more rhetoric than reality when it comes to the transformation of family and intimate citizenship in contemporary Ireland? Okay, so that's my key question. Now I'm going to move on to the next question, I suppose, which is a kind of a shifting gear, really. And first of all, I suppose I want to just, again, this is a massive topic. So what I'm trying to do, I suppose, here is just boil down, really, the way in which family has been studied and constructed. And then I want to go on and ask a basic question: what is happening to families in the context of Irish society, as a way of looking at that question of rhetoric and reality. So again, just to provide some context, we're lacking, I think, in what we might call integrated research on the Irish family. We don't have a massive historical tome, for instance, on the history of the family. What we have are aspects of family and personal life being looked at in various ways in the Irish studies. So, for instance, historians, demographers, anthropologists and sociologists have investigated a wide range of issues in relation to the family over the course of the 19th and the 20th century in a historical context. So the kinds of issues that have been looked at are, for instance, among anthropologists in particular, the deeply embedded relationship that existed between family, kinship, economy and community in rural Ireland, and that seemed to sustain for a longer period in the Irish context than in some other Western European countries. Again, Arnsberg and Kimball in their study of County Clare looked at, I suppose, the resilience of the extended family model and how, you know, the family, vis-a-vis the family farm, was the hub of economic production in society, and this kind of complex reproduction of this social system. Others have looked at questions around abject poverty, inequality, class. A lot has been done in terms of family in relation to gender and women's rights. I'm thinking of Joanna Burke's earlier work. There's lots of examples, some of Mary Daly's work. Illegitimacy, reproduction and fertility has been examined. There's a new collection by Elaine Farrell et al. Infanticide, a very interesting hidden topic in Irish culture. Some historians have looked at that. Domestic violence, childhood and child welfare, religion, sexuality, Dermot Ferreter's work being very important there. And of course, finally, the distinctive demographic patterns in relation to marriage, non-marriage, fertility and emigration in the post-famine period. So here I suppose we have a snapshot of the kinds of questions and issues that have been looked at in Irish studies in the 19th and the 20th century in particular. So I'm going to move forward from the rhetoric bit, I suppose, now to the social reality part of the paper by asking a basic sociological question concerning transformation. So what are the changes that have occurred over time in the arena of family in Irish society? Is a very basic question. And then I suppose I want to go on and maybe try and interpret some of those changes. So we look at the 60s, 70s, right up to the present. And as I say, it's a sort of a composite view of the key arenas in change, because these are complex processes, but I've done my best to sort of provide a composite analysis for our benefit today. Just a few words about theory first, and social change. And I suppose transformation, change, these are concepts that have been heavily theorised, not just in relation to family. We've just been discussing there, are they the same thing, change and transformation? Arguably, change is perhaps more an adaptive process, whereas transformation is something more fundamental. And again, we can debate that a bit later. But it is interesting that the history of the family and complexity of social change has generated vibrant scholarly debate. So I suppose taken together in recent decades, the variety of new family forms and trends observed in the West in some quarters has been said to reflect a kind of decline in the family based on marriage, and perhaps even a decline in the very idea of family itself. So writers like Popenoe and so forth. So why would the family be in decline? Well, I suppose the kinds of changes that we've witnessed in the Western context include things like obviously very high rates of marital breakdown, stroke divorce, what we might call reconstituted families. So in the aftermath of separation, you have blended families or step parents, all of these kind of varieties of new family forms we see emerging. Cohabiting couples in some societies, such as Northern European societies, there are more couples cohabiting than married. So begging the question, is cohabitation, what used to be called in Ireland living in sin, replaced marriage as a family form? Transnational families, lone parents, and we'll look at that in a minute in relation to Ireland, gay and lesbian families, working mothers, civil partnership, assisted reproduction, delayed and declining fertility, and what we might call voluntary childlessness and singledom. So these are all, I suppose, changes that, I suppose, the more conservative interpretation of change and transformation is that somehow this indicates family as an institution or a group in decline, or in crisis even. So we'll look at that in a minute. Prominent social theorists such as Giddens, Beck and Beck-Gernsheim and Bauman have written extensively about what they call the transformation of intimacy that is said to have radically changed society more generally in late modernity. For Giddens, a radical transformation in intimate relations was underway in the last decades of the 20th century with potentially radical consequences for the entire social fabric. So I suppose we often talk about the economy as the driver or the motor of change, or the political sphere or whatever, but actually the role of intimacy and the intimate sphere as being a driver of change and modernity is something that has been neglected. And for Giddens, this is, as I said there, it has potentially radical consequences, the way we're living our intimate lives through family, marriage and relationships. So the high rates of divorce, greater sexual freedoms, advances in women's rights and the emergence of lone parenthood, for example, were considered symptoms of individualization, fluidity, and what some have called a process of detraditionalization, where the expressed needs and choices of individuals are said to take priority over the conventions of social institutions such as marriage. So perhaps to put that another way, what this means is that the obligation to the social group, such as the family, no longer takes priority over the desires and needs of the individual. The role of reproduction in sexual relations also began to wane, while the notion of romantic love for personal fulfillment was considered to have gained significance and, some would argue, ultimate power in the media, in popular culture, literature itself, and indeed perhaps the economy. So that's one view, this kind of view of this kind of fundamental transformation of intimacy, where everything becomes about our personal choice. It's less about our obligations to the social group, the family, and in a sense this is supposed to explain the kind of new kinds of family forms and relationships we see emerging. At the same time, a range of other theorists, driven by a more empirical agenda, have departed from the view that the family as an institution was breaking down, and suggest that this kind of fragmentation of traditional family forms has been overstated. Karl Smart, for instance, the Manchester sociologist, has notably criticised the fixation of many commentators with the decline of commitment and even the decline of the possibility of family life. Instead, Smart puts forward a new way of understanding families and relationships, which I think is instructive in examining the changing nature of family life in the context of Ireland. Smart emphasises things like the resilience of connectedness, relationality, and the embeddedness of our personal relationships alongside these very profound changes that are occurring in late Western modernity, such as very high incidence and rates of divorce. Her approach prioritises the complex bonds negotiated between people, things like the significance of emotions, memory, family secrets, and the underestimated importance of things such as shared possessions or homes in the maintenance of relationships. Okay, so how do these ideas apply in the case of Ireland? Do they apply? Are they useful? Has Irish family patterns entered into this kind of period of individualisation where the obligation is to the individual rather than the social group, in the kinds of way that Arensberg and Kimball emphasised, I suppose, the way in which family roles were predefined. Okay, so what has changed over time in Ireland, and how does Ireland compare with other European societies? Okay, so I suppose the next bit is just really this kind of assessment of what has been happening to families. And I'm going to start with Ireland up to the 60s. Now again, as I said, these are quite complex processes, but what I've done is try to summarise some of the key questions. So for much of the 20th century, Ireland was considered a demographic outlier in Europe, and the situation was quite distinctive. So again, this I suppose feeds into this whole idea of Irish exceptionalism, that there was something distinctive about Irish family structures that weren't that needed to be explained. The key features of Ireland's social structure up to the 60s were, first of all, a class structure dominated by a large agricultural population with the majority employed on the land. So with the majority of the population involved in some way with agriculture. Secondly, what we might call a rural profile and ethos. And I suppose the idea of a rural profile and ethos is that this wasn't just the social structure, this was something that was valued and encouraged you see, we were talking about Newman earlier, but you see in earlier church interventions, thinking of Bishop Lucy in particular, describing the city as a kind of an evil place to be avoided, because it could kind of contaminate young women or give them ideas. So a rural way of life, again, De Valera would have very much echoed this, was considered the ideal, with lots of children preferably, and the comely maidens dancing at the crossroads. Okay, economic protectionism in the mid-century, high levels of emigration and overall population decline, and distinctive patterns in family and demography that broadly encompassed a late age of marriage, a high rate of non-marriage, and a high marital fertility rate, resulting in distinctly large families. And also, Patrick also mentioned earlier the climate of censorship regarding sexual and intimate matters, as well as examples of social control, really, resulting in harsh treatment for women who had children outside of marriage, and for children categorised as deviant. So these are all, I suppose, the key features of Ireland's social structure vis-a-vis family and marriage up to the 1960s. So in a nutshell, Irish demographic patterns were considered to be distinct on all these indicators. The marriage rate was comparatively low. So in a sense, I suppose, what some have described is an Irish reluctance to marry. There's a lot of focus on marriage and the high fertility rates within marriage, but I think what's just as interesting is the rates of non-marriage. So men and women got married in Ireland at a later age than their European counterparts, but when they did, they had large families. However, one of the issues I feel quite strongly about is the fact that non-marriage is never looked at in the same detail as marriage in all the key studies. This reflects what my colleague Anne Byrne calls matromania, so obsession with marriage. But the so-called reluctance to marry at all is a key feature of 20th century Irish history. Interestingly, just sidebar point, if we fast forward ahead, what we see now is a certain reluctance to divorce at the current conjuncture, evident in the very low divorce rates, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And again, even more interestingly, farmers have the lowest divorce rate in the country, so that suggests again this, these kind of family structures wedded to land, identity, and family are still very powerful. Anyway, okay, so yeah, a reluctance to marry, if that's the right word, non-marriage is probably a better word, is really, really important. Again, something like 25% of adult women, about a third of men in the 1930s didn't marry. So it's, you have high figures. Irish literature, for instance, is infused with complicated and often actually very sad single characters. I'm thinking here in particular of the character of Bridie in the Ballroom of Romance. There's a whole sag, isn't there, about her lack of marriage, and it's really, really very sad. And these stories must have been duplicated over and over again, given the high rates of non-marriage. Anyhow, so non-marriage must be looked at alongside marriage if we are to arrive at a deeper understanding of family, love and marriage in 20th century Irish culture and history. Okay. By the 1960s, however, new trends that coincided with economic modernisation policies and radicalising social movements were emerging in Irish society. And it's quite interesting, I suppose, again, just to put it in the comparative context, the 1950s in the Western context are described as the golden age of marriage. Again, I think we have to be careful not to exaggerate marriage when we're talking about family. So in the 1950s, we refer to the golden age of marriage because more people got married than ever before, but also they got married at a younger age. So there was more marriage. Again, my parents' generation were part of that. When we got married in our early 20s, but that was out of sync with this kind of older age or postponed marriage that had been happening up until the 1960s and these high rates of non-marriage. So the golden age of marriage is about younger age of marriage, but also what we might call more marriage. And indeed, when we talk about the same-sex marriage referendum in a minute, arguably that's about more marriage as well. So So we see from the 1960s on again in Ireland, we see the same trend, and maybe a little bit later than other countries, but we see a younger age of marriage emerging, and there is more marriage. So the rate of non-marriage begins to decrease in comparison to those past decades. The other things we see, again, Mary McAleese referred to this beautifully last night, longer formal schooling of marriage partners, and in particular greater educational opportunities for women. Again, we also see the increased involvement of the welfare state and the state in the family, and I think this has been very critical as well in terms of understanding transformation in recent decades. Perhaps the most significant piece of legislation or significant change to be introduced was in 1974, I think, what was called at the time, we can get away with it now, the Unmarried Mothers Allowance, which in a sense was a recognition, of these kinds of changes that people like Giddens, Bauman, etc. have been looking at in the context of late modernity. They also introduced the Deserted Wives Allowance. Again, the idea that if a man and a woman in those days separated, the woman of course had to have been deserted rather than be separated. So it was kind of, again, the language of these social welfare allowances are actually quite indicative of the times, really. And the Prisoner's Wives Allowance was introduced. So you had the unmarried mothers, the deserted wives, and the prisoner's wives. 3 different ones. Today we just have a one-parent allowance, which is for men and women, not just gendered in that sense. Okay, we also have a radical and active women's movement emerging by the 1970s, which questioned traditional family values, as well as women's constitutionally defined primary role in society as mothers in the home. The right of women to access contraception and to engage in productive work outside as well as inside the home was vigorously campaigned for by second-wave feminists from the 1970s on. For some scholars and activists at this time, the family itself was considered the core site of women's oppression in society, with marriage invariably considered a form of domestic and or sexual slavery. I suppose this critique emerged not least in light of the utter resistance in the Irish state to legalising contraceptives right into the 1980s, which was, I suppose, based on the assumption that all Irish women should be mothers or at least potential mothers. And of course, I think, just again, listening to the discussion of the Constitution last night and the law, which was very interesting, I do think, though, there's another way of looking at that, and I think often legal change actually happens long after social change has actually occurred. The law simply catches up with changes that are already long underway, I think. So I think we shouldn't overbake the role of the law or the Constitution either. I think what we see happening in society can be more complex in that sense. And the law doesn't always provide all the answers, even though it is, of course, critical in determining our intimate citizenship. So, so the Irish family was about to enter into a period of significant social change and radical questioning, and analysts started to assess whether or not Irish family patterns were at last radically departing from the resilience of tradition and were converging closer to European norms, or were they continuing to follow a distinctive path? Convergence theorists became very obsessed with this in the 80s and the 90s, looking at trends in Ireland. Was Ireland converging closer to the rest of Europe, or was it still following a distinctive path on a range of indicators: family, demography, marriage, births, etc.? So what was happening, basically? So I suppose one school of thought was that Irish society, therefore, was... sorry, I forgot to put that up as I was talking. Just covered that. I'll leave it up. Irish society was being considered to have embraced more secular European-wide values in personal and intimate life late. So this notion of delayed modernity, okay? But when modernisation with the rest and convergence with the rest of Europe did occur, allegedly it was rapid. So you have this theme of late development, but then rapid development. And I think without embracing modernisation theory, which I'm going to critique in a minute, there is an element of truth in this on a range of indicators that when change did occur in certain arenas, such as the participation of women in the labour force during the Celtic Tiger, which happened very quickly and very rapidly, and suddenly was surpassing the participation rates in other countries. It was delayed, but when it happened very quickly. I think there is an element of truth on a range of indicators. You might say divorce is another example. Divorce wasn't legalised until it was narrowly passed by referendum in 1995, and that was some decades after it had been brought in other countries. It wasn't by no means the latest. The latest was Malta in 2011, and certainly Spain and Portugal introduced divorce quite late as well. But compared to other countries, including the UK, 1995 was late. So we have this theme of late modernity, a kind of a catching up, a convergence occurring. And for some, this kind of indicated that familial patterns in Ireland would simply converge to the rest of Europe. At the same time, what is happening in contemporary family life? What are the changes that have occurred? Has the Irish family transformed, so utterly changed? Has this process of convergence, if you like, reached its end point, where you have, as I said earlier, higher rates of marital separation, working mothers, all the indicators of so-called modernisation? So, by the 21st century, Ireland had the following, and I'm going to break these down in a moment, so I'll just list them through first, and then we'll go through some of them, in particular the non-marital birth rate. So, by the noughties, the 21st century, Ireland had a relatively high non-marital birth rate compared to a number of other European countries. And this comes from a society context, where having a child outside of marriage was so incredibly stigmatised. As I said a moment ago, women with young children were participating in the labour force in rapidly increasing numbers during the Celtic Tiger for the first time. And again, if you look at the data around that, it is women with young children who are driving that number up. So it's very much a generational thing. Homosexuality had been decriminalised. Cohabitation was in evidence alongside conventional marriage. Contraception was legalised and accessible, and marital separation legislation had been introduced since 1987, and divorce then ultimately in 1995. So, and of course more recently then same-sex marriage has been introduced, begging the question that I asked at the beginning: has Ireland truly arrived as a haven of liberal rights and tolerance in the context of intimate citizenship, which is Ken Plummer's term? So, at face value, if you look at this, it appeared in the noughties that the family had undergone a process of delayed but extremely rapid transformation and modernisation, and was gradually aligning with more secular European values and trends in the arena of family and personal life. However, I want to argue that Ireland, in reality, represents a more complex case study in the context of interpreting 21st century family life. And I think there's a more complex interpretation of the transformation of intimacy that is said to govern Western modernity. So I'm going to take you through some key trends just in this next bit. So a key issue is that Irish family patterns today are closely converging to prevailing European trends in some arenas, but not in others. And the ones we would expect the convergence to be in are not actually the case. So that's my kind of line of argument. And I'm necessarily going to have to use some facts just to demonstrate this. So in terms of where you might suggest that Irish family patterns are closely converging to prevailing European trends, the arenas which I would highlight are, first of all, the rate of non-marital births. So the rate of births outside of marriage is converging closer to European statistics or averages. The second area is the crude marriage rate, which again, as I pointed out, was traditionally lower in Ireland for much of the 20th century, has now converged closer to European averages. So this reluctance to marriage, in comparison to other European societies, isn't really evident anymore. So there is so-called convergence in some areas. Okay, there's a very high non-marital birth rate, and the marriage rate is pretty similar to the rest of Europe. But in other areas, distinctive trends are evident. And that don't indicate the kind of radical transformation that Giddens and Beck and Beck-Gernsheim were talking about. Okay, so in other areas, for instance, the divorce rate remains distinctly low. It's one of the, I think it's the second lowest divorce rate in Europe. And again, you see here some of the kind of, I think they must be from the 1995 campaign. The symbolism of that campaign, the level of conflict, the level of passion that went into the campaign. And yet, when divorce was achieved and introduced, there hasn't been that rushing to the floodgates. Okay, it's a distinctly low divorce rate. And I'll come back to as to why that might be the case in a minute. The other thing that doesn't fit is Irish mothers. I don't like this term anyway. Irish mothers are the most fertile and oldest in Europe. Okay, so again, this is quite interesting that the fertility, the steep decline in fertility that has occurred in some other countries. We have very, very low fertility rates. The natural replacement rate isn't enough to replace the population. Hasn't occurred in Ireland. So in some areas, yes, non-marital births are very high. It's not the one you would expect, because it was an area where Ireland had deeply traditional attitudes, having children outside of marriage. And then in other areas, Ireland is out of sync. It still has high fertility rates. Okay? So there's a complex tension between traditional values and modernity in Irish family life, and as a consequence in intimate relationships, more generally understood. Finola Kennedy, for instance, has aptly stated that the story of family change in Ireland is both unique and at the same time similar to that of many other countries. The available data continues to present a mixed picture in relation to divorce, cohabitation, the number of children living in one-parent households, and the overall fertility rates. Statistical trends in Ireland are not fully in line with European averages. In relation to cohabitation, there are also lower rates of cohabitation in the Irish context. So again, much lower than some other countries. Now, I just want to pick on this example of non-marital birth. I could go through, I could give you a very boring breakdown of the figures in cohabitation and marriage and what the exact statistics are. But I do want to focus on non-marital births because I think this is, again, in terms of what you were talking about, Patrick, as well earlier, this is very interesting in terms of, it cuts across so many issues around women's rights, around the institutionalization of so-called fallen women, around migration, I think, as well, in terms of, I suppose, women leaving, emigrating because they were pregnant, all of those kinds of issues. So, in the case of non-marital births, the rate in Ireland is approximately 34% of all births occur outside of marriage. So that's just over a third. So a third of all children in Ireland are now born outside of the institution of marriage. In the cities, again, if you break it down, it's actually, I think in Cork, it's something like 48, 49%. So Cork, Dublin, Limerick, half of the children who've been born in the maternity hospitals today in those cities are actually born to a parent or parents who are not married. Now, if you want to say radical transformation, if you compare that to the society, which literally banished pregnant women, pregnant single women, this really is a radical, I would argue, and dramatic turnaround. But I suppose, so historically, this is significant. In the context of Ireland, this is significant historically. But in the context of the rest of Europe, is it? So 34% is not exceeding the European average of 38%. So it's actually a bit under it. But I suppose what is interesting is that the non-marital birth rate in Ireland is much higher than some other countries you might expect Ireland to compare with. So here I'm thinking of, again, Italy, Greece, I think I have the figure here, where only 7.4% of all births are outside of marriage. So again, Ireland is in the middle there. It's approximating to the European average. Okay, a third of children are born outside marriage across Europe as a whole. But when you break it down within different countries, it is actually quite significant because it's higher than another number of other countries. But it's not as high, I suppose, as then Iceland, for instance, where 60% of all births are outside of marriage as a whole. So again, it's kind of interesting to see Ireland there as not being the exception, but not being, as not being the exception, but then actually being quite different to some other countries that you might expect it to approximate to. So in the case of single parents who are not cohabiting or in a relationship, the current situation in Ireland is noteworthy, I think. And remember, just because children are born outside marriage, it doesn't mean they're not born to parents who are cohabiting. So it's not all single parents. But I think in the case of single parents, I think this is noteworthy. So in the past, as we know, illegitimacy was utterly frowned upon and stigmatised. And the UK, as we know, became a refuge for Irish unmarried mothers to the extent that they were afforded the label PFIs by social services. And you can see this in the files. PFI stands for Pregnant from Ireland. So this was a commonly used acronym. Yeah, it's in the files, social work files of the time. Okay, so adoption rates were high as a consequence of unmarried mothers concealing their pregnancies, often with the assistance of Catholic church and mother and baby homes. In Ireland, however, while the largest proportion of households today is made up of couple households with children, Ireland at the same time has a much higher percentage of children living in lone parent households than in much of the rest of Europe. And now, a Eurostat survey was conducted in 2011. Now, some people are questioning the validity of this survey, because the figures are so high. Okay, but I'll give you the figures anyway. I don't see any reason to question this survey, but a lot of people are questioning it because the figures are so high. They're saying, how can this be? So the 2011 Eurostat survey showed that nearly a quarter of Irish children lived in a one-parent family, 23%, compared to the European average of 13.6%. So one in 4 children living in Ireland in a single or lone parent household. The figure for Spain was 7% and Italy 11%. Interestingly, the UK was 21%, so Ireland and the UK are very close in that sense in terms of the figures. On the other hand, 2/3 of Irish families live in traditional married households, which is below the European average of 74%. So this, it's quite phenomenal to see that the rate of children living in one-parent families in Ireland is considerably higher than several other countries and higher than the European average. So, given the fact that the vast majority of lone parents in Ireland are women, this distinct trend and the data available suggests that women in Ireland are putting motherhood before marriage to a much greater extent than their European counterparts, and interestingly are cohabiting less, which again is a trend that requires further investigation, because although the rate of one-parent households is much higher, the rate of cohabitation is significantly lower. Okay, so this raises an interesting question. I suppose if you really want me to drill down the figures, what's also really interesting is the class dimension of these figures as well on one-parent households. So obviously the vast majority of one-parent households are headed by women, okay? And I think 97% of those who are registered for the one-parent allowance are actually women as well. So it's very much a feminised process. So most single lone mothers in Ireland have one child, and it's actually the middle-class mothers who are having the larger families, which is a direct contrast to the past, where it was working-class families that are actually larger. Okay. So this recurrent theme, this recurrent theme of a reluctance to marry is actually, I think, again, playing itself out in a very interesting way in these contemporary trends and in ways which we might not expect. Okay, moving along then just very quickly to the last bit. I also just want to say something briefly. With 10% of the current Irish population now not born in Ireland, the number of mixed Irish or non-Irish households is also on the rise. Well, there is an increasing number of mixed international families in Ireland where one partner is Irish and the other is not. Legal, social and political acceptance of these newer Irish citizens is slower to change. So this could be seen as part of a growing global stratification of citizenship and belonging, where the formal status of citizenship does not ensure acceptance or belonging to a nation, or on the other hand, continued assertions by mixed Irish or non-Irish families of their right to be Irish continues to challenge the notion that in order to be considered truly Irish, one must be WHISC, that stands for white, heterosexual, Irish-born, settled and Catholic. Okay, so again there's a whole other issue there that I don't have time to look at. Okay, so to conclude. So the idea of postmodernism implies that we can no longer deal with a single entity called the family. Yet the findings I present suggest that the situation is more complex in the Irish case. Traditional forms of family life, such as the lifelong nuclear family based on heterosexual marriage, continue and sustain alongside new, more diverse family forms and households emerging in contemporary Ireland, such as one-parent families, reconstituted families, etc., cohabitees, etc. So taken together, the new forms of family and intimate life that are now evident in Ireland fundamentally challenge the notion that there is only one way to be married, intimate, and committed to another person in the Irish context. At the same time, these developments have not even remotely replaced the predominance of conventional family forms and trends. They, we might say 1 in 4 children lives in a one-parent families, but the other 3 out of every 4 live in a conventional, so-called conventional family. Okay, I had a little bit about theory. I'm just going to skip on then to the final bit. I suppose I just wanted to say a bit at the end about the passing of the same-sex referendum. Is that okay, Mary? I'll be 2 minutes, 1 minute, literally. So I suppose in keeping with that theme that, if I can find the quote, Carol Coulter says a key feature of the recent campaign for same-sex marriage was the extent to which a different, inclusive version of the family, with love rather than duty at its core, was invoked by those promoting change. Love is the answer, it seems. Again, I suppose a number of questions arise about the same-sex referendum. One of the questions I have is, will there be a very slow uptake of same-sex marriage post the referendum, like what happened when divorce was introduced in 1995? Will the victory be more symbolic in terms of the tension between tradition and modernity being played out in Irish public discourse? And Irish studies, I think, as of yet, has to dissect these important questions. How we love and how we marry are critical questions for all disciplines in the field. On the other hand, I just want to finish by saying, who cares really? May 22nd was a joyous moment, and I think we should end this conference by seizing that moment. I have a little bit of footage. Do you want me to show it? Or yeah, it's just, I just really did want to end with this, the noble call. But what I'm actually going to show, I'm not going to show the noble call, you can look that up. I think this final image, I just find it quite amusing on the one hand, but on the other hand, incredibly moving. So it's an image of Jerry Adams, Panty Bliss, the Minister for Justice, at that great symbol of colonial and post-colonial subversion, Dublin Castle. And I think it's a great note with which to end today.
Jerry Adams, why do you think it has been such a resounding yes vote? Why do you think the Irish people voted the way they did today?
Well, I think that people are very sorry and given the chance when Conservative elites kept a lid on all of these issues, then people were suppressed. But they seized the moment, and Panty and other people who have made a stand, and all of the people who stood up. It was very moving to be at community meetings, to be at activist meetings, people standing up and telling their stories. So to Ciarta, Guinea, Iraq and Shin Untach Shin Gohali. A wonderful day for Ireland. We need to get this into the north now. It's already across the entire island.
Sinn Féin, as they say. But in terms of Mary McAleese, do you think she played an important role, Jerry?
I have found that at Pride and Broad events that I've gone to, that most of the people I met were grannies, mothers, aunts, fathers, brothers, sisters, who have loved ones who happen to be gay or lesbian, and from that community, and they made the difference.
The individual stories were critical, because everybody can relate to an individual story. The mums and dads talking about their children, what it was like, the young people talking about their experience in this country. Ursula Halligan, Tom Curran, Mary McAleese, Justin McAleese, all of these individuals, because everybody understands an individual story and the impact that the situation was having on their lives. So they were very powerful stories.
The personal, go on.
Well, I don't feel that sometimes there was some suggestion during the campaign that this was a top-down initiative, that it was sort of a government elite that was sort of forcing this question on the people and that people didn't really want it. But first of all, I think the size of the turnout just shows that the people actually did want this referendum. But also, this isn't a campaign that's just been going on for the last 3 or 4 months. This has been a 40-year campaign, and it is the epitome of a grassroots campaign. It started with a tiny number of incredibly brave men and women who stood up and said, actually I have nothing to be ashamed of. And over 40 years they, gathered more support little by little and made small achievements. And it took 40 years, but we finally got to the point where actually the country is on board with what those few tiny, number of men and women decided 40 years ago.
It's also a brilliant campaign to be part of, because it was enthusiastic, it was happy, there was idealism, it was positive, and that met a response and an echo on the doorsteps and on the streets. And I'm mindful of a young man who was beaten to death in Fairview in 1982. That was the first time that we were ever engaged in standing up for, at that time it was called gay rights. So there have been people who have given an awful lot, who over that 40 years, as Panty has said, who made a stand. It's the only place to be, but the people have told them that they're welcome, that this is their Ireland, that it's good to be gay, and it's good to be Irish today.
And it really was the people, because when you're out on the canvas, it wasn't just, you fired at, young LGBT activists. There was head-start grannies and shaven-headed students and straight men and grannies and parents and brothers and sisters and friends. It really was a sort of inspiring campaign.
It was. There was a great atmosphere in the polling stations yesterday. People behind the desks in the polling stations were saying this was amazing to see all the young people coming in. It was a very happy atmosphere, and it felt like we'd had a great conversation as a country, and we were having a great vote with a high turnout for a referendum and across all the age groups.
And Minister, I said it to Jim Walsh earlier, the Senator who was advocating Naomi, very graciously came here today, when he was saying people are still a bit worried about some of the children's issues, so you can legislate now, hopefully, for things like surrogacy and issues that maybe people worried about, perhaps wrongly, but they did worry about.
Okay, I'll give them the last word. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very much, Linda. I'm trying to get guidance from Lance whether there's any time for questions.
I think we've got time for maybe two couple questions. I'm going to suggest that we might carry on elsewhere, but let's have a couple of questions immediately.
Quickly,
A quick question about that 2011 statistic around single-headed families. Given that it's so short after 2008, could it be particularly high because so many in so many families, one of the adults had to leave Ireland at that time to get employment, leaving the family behind. Would that have exacerbated that figure?
No, I don't think so, because again, we have the 2011 census figures as well, which do look at marital status. So I'm guessing, I mean, there has been a problem in the past with separation, because before divorce was brought in, for instance, some people would, maybe one partner would put themselves down as separated, but the other would put themselves down as still married because they weren't divorced, or they saw themselves as still married even though they were separated. So I think, yes, with all statistics, absolutely, there's probably, but no, I don't think so. I think, marital status is where a lot of these statistics are coming from, as opposed to, but there is obviously more transnational mobility and cohabiting families, transnational families, absolutely, and a lot of work has been done on that, actually. It's interesting, yeah.
I just want to ask quickly, I was intrigued by the link you drew between kind of reluctance to marry and the high percentage of mothers being the head of a one-parent family.
Yeah.
Just wonder what you felt the impact of the lack of access to abortion had on those kinds of figures.
Again, a very, very interesting and complicated issue. I mean, one of the reasons that's often suggested by journalists for the relatively high non-marital birth rate in the context of Ireland is the lack of availability of abortion. But if you look at the figures on abortion that we do have, Ireland has actually quite a high abortion rate. It's higher than, I don't know, it's a while now since I've looked at data, but I know it's certainly higher than Netherlands, for instance. And so there's, because you have better access to contraception, you have more sex education. So all these things, in a sense, feed in. Most of the focus in the abortion debate in recent years has been on maternal health. It hasn't been on abortion as a reproductive right. It's been actually on those kind of what the lawyers call hard cases. So yes, it's a factor, but it's again probably not as significant as we might think. Yeah.
Well, I know I can't call any more questions, even though I know there's a couple already queuing, but
you can ask me after.
Yeah. So I want on your behalf to thank Linda for a very comprehensive account of Ireland's pattern of late and rapid modernisation, and then on the one hand looking at how, and on the other hand looking at how it's intermediately placed in relation to a number of other European countries in relationship to issues to do with family and children. But I felt really the clip at the end, the highly ironic clip at many, many levels, in a way really proved Mary McAleese's argument last night, rather than the nuanced argument you were putting forward now, because in a way what she was arguing that there's so much social transformation that has already occurred in Ireland. And it's true, and I think that's a tension in the title and in the conference, but there has been so much, but it doesn't exclude the fact that there might be need for more. So on that end,
very good.